So welcome, Dee. Thank you for joining us today. This is for our Leadership Stories podcast, and our first series, we're having conversations with senior leaders. So we'll talk about your career, how you got here. Did you ever think you would be a chief exec in your career? We'll have a chat about what you think good leadership looks like, and how do you want to show up as a leader? And then who's inspired you? What's your toughest leadership challenge been? And then we'll come to a close. What the question we're asking everyone is, what do you think is the biggest leadership challenge at this time? So welcome.
Thank you.
So you are the chief exec of IRIS, and I did look this up, Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services.
Yep, very catchy.
Very catchy. As Leading to Change, we love what you guys do, and we feature your resources in our Friday emails quite a lot. So it's great to have you with us. Thank you for spending the time.
Great. Looking forward to it.
So can we start just with your career history? What's your journey been to this point?
Grand. Okay, it's a great question because I never I didn't really see it as a journey because that sounds very intentional because I didn't think this was the job I'd end up in. So I originally trained as a scientist. I did neuropharmacology. I was not a very good scientist in the lab, so it was probably just as well that I didn't pursue that. And I then retrained as a social worker. So I practiced for a while in social work. Then I was looking for how you change the system. So I went to the government. And I'm just going to leave that there as to whether I managed to find the place to stand to make the change. For a few years, then I moved to the voluntary sector, did roles in research, evaluation, and then for 10 years I was a policy officer for the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland. And I was their deputy CEO for a while as well. And that was more a kind of representation, kind of lobbying kind of role, and then I moved to IRIS. So I don't know if that's a journey or a meander, probably.
I often find where I start doesn't dictate where I get to in the end. Some journeys are better with the end not in mind. Have there been any key themes in terms of the decisions you've made in your career as to why you've moved a particular way?
I think there's been probably two things that have driven those choices, and I suppose I'm at risk of retrofitting, so hold it lightly. One is I have really been looking for where you can change the system from. And I thought that the best way to change the system was to be the boss. I'm not quite sure about that now, but that was probably the driver in my 20s to say, actually, positional leaders, they've got the leverage, they can make it happen. And the other one was I've been pretty fortunate in most of my jobs in that there has been a senior leader in those jobs who has encouraged me to go and train, given me opportunities, dropped me wholesale in at the deep end, one person in particular, but with a view to saying, we think you could develop these skills and you could step into this role. So kind of two things.
Was there anything that surprised you in your career?
Few things. Probably the main thing was I think when I started in my career, I thought senior leaders totally had it all together and that they knew exactly what they were doing. They were somehow a different species of person who had really got a handle on everything. And one of the useful things about some of the people I worked with is that they showed me some of the working behind the scenes. So you weren't quite so probably in awe of the role, which I think oddly was helpful. In that,
A look behind the curtain, as it
yeah,
were.
exactly. Yeah, it's not the Wizard of Oz. It's you see behind the curtain.
It's interesting, isn't it? Even now, still a bit of a mystique about people in really senior posts, that they must be very good at something, or they must have done something amazing, or be a certain kind of person. Did you ever see yourself as a chief exec?
No, because I think my picture of chief execs, maybe unfairly, but it's kind of shaped by the sort of 1980s sort of executive kind of type. So let's say it's a guy, probably middle-aged, sharply turned out, very, very confident, very, able to speak in those wonderful sound bites with the top line and the three supporting statements, and, very much a kind of probably a caricature of leadership, but that was definitely something in there. And as someone who is probably a bit more to the introverted end of the spectrum, I did think that leadership might exclude that because you really needed to be highly extroverted, good at networking, and all that kind of thing. But I'm seeing much more of a variation. Yeah, particularly in third sector leadership, because I think there's a huge range of organisations. So there's like SMEs like IRIS, we're quite small, right through to these massive organisations. And there seems therefore to be a bit more of kind of range of leadership styles, or perhaps it feels a bit more open to that kind of diversity in ways of leading.
We've maybe come away from that idea of that fixed chief exec who, I mean, I'm thinking of all those 80s films that used to feature like Michael J. Fox, and it was always the navy suit. And I worked in the financial sector for 20 years, and it was always the navy suit, the tan shoes, tan belt, big watch type thing. And this idea of a charismatic leader, you know, they had the charm that could be put on to convince and influence as well. Who has inspired you in terms of being different as a senior leader? And it might be somebody famous or it might be somebody local to yourself.
Okay. Well, probably there's a few people, because one of the great things about working for CCPS was I worked mainly with chief executives in the third sector. So I saw that range of leadership style, from the sort of classic hero leader through to the more kind of, I'd say, more networked, systemsy kind of leader. She's going to be mortified if I say this, but I have worked for many years with Andrea Wood from Key. She has a wonderful balance of being focused on doing the absolute best for supported people, but there's a warmth and a kindness about the way the organisation operates that I think comes from the top, and she's going to kill me for saying that. She'll be so mortified, but that's also part of, I think, her success as a leader.
That desire not necessarily to be spotlighted for self, but rather those that you're working on behalf of or working with.
That's exactly it. There's a facilitative edge there. Like, you know, how do we do the best we can with what we've got for the purpose, the people we support? But it's not without that decisiveness, ability to analyse and do the kind of functional tasks of leadership that I sometimes think we can lose when we overcorrect over into the, you know, the kind of emotional intelligence aspects. So she has both of those, and I think that's quite, I don't use the word inspirational often, but yeah, close to that, yeah.
That's really interesting, isn't it, when we think about the preconceived idea of a chief exec at one end of the spectrum and what you're describing there, which is a really lovely example. It appears to be that there are a wider range of chief executive or senior leaders, let's not just say just chief execs, senior leadership posts that I'm not sure we would have allowed before or we would have accepted before. So that range of finding the right post, and maybe how much of that is the right organisation. To what extent does an organisation's values or purpose influence your decision or your interest in working with them or for them?
I'm probably a little cynical about stated values, because I think one of the, and in fact there's some very, people are much more knowledgeable about this than me, particularly Bob Sutton, you know, the leadership researcher, says one of the problems in leadership is our leaders are often rewarded for what they say, not what they do or what they create. And he's talking about leadership as a whole, you know, kind of, and he's US based, so it's kind of quite a broad picture. But that makes me cynical about stated values. But lived values, I know it sounds like a bit of a semantic thing, but lived values are really influential. You know, like, how do you feel when you go into an organisation? That intangible thing about, you know, what's the personal reception like? You know, how does the kind of welcome feel? How does your interactions with even the finance guy feel? You know, that kind of culture, intangible, difficult to put a finger on. It's probably more influential than stated value. Purpose, absolutely. I think it's difficult to work in our sector if you don't have some kind of social purpose. You wouldn't really come into this business otherwise, I don't suppose. But again, it's about actual purpose versus stated purpose. So I'm probably sort of coming back to Sutton's point about what are we doing, what are we creating, rather than what are we saying.
John Lees, who is a career coach, is well known through the UK. I've worked with him before. He has a phrase where he talks about values being laminated, not lived. And I did work on one site where they were laminated 10 foot tall in the hallway of a particular building, and I remember looking at that thinking, this is not what I experience in this place of work. So it's really key, isn't it, that if there is a disconnect between what an organisation is saying it's all about and then how it actually feels to work in that place. What do you think good leadership looks like when we think about, I guess we're talking about psychological safety, aren't we, and the cultures of organisations and how safe it is to be yourself in that space. What do you think good leadership looks like to enable that?
I think, again, it's I'm sounding very much like I'm walking down the middle of something here, but I think it is a balance of a whole bunch of things. But I did have an experience of this recently with my board. So I'm very lucky. I've got a great board, and I work for a third sector organisation in which the CEO is accountable to the board, and also the board sets strategic direction, things like that. So I meet with them regularly to talk about various things. And I had one of those weird moments where somebody said to me, I didn't have the answer to the question they had. And there was a moment where I thought I should try and fudge this like a proper leader, quote unquote, like a hero CEO who will just say, oh yes, of course we can do that, or no, we can't. But because my board are good leaders, I said, actually, I don't know the answer to that question. And somebody on my board who is a very senior strategic leader in a much bigger organisation than mine, then kind of validated it and said, actually, thank you for telling us the truth. That was good leadership right there, Dee, which was slightly embarrassing, but a good thing to call out, because he was trying to create that conditions for truthfulness and leadership without burdening colleagues inappropriately. So again, there's a kind of balance there. Like, I try really hard to be as transparent as possible as a leader, but also your job is to carry some of that and not to just emotionally spill over onto all your colleagues who are busy doing the doing. So I think there's a kind of balance there. So that's one component. And again, thinking about the board, that is set from the top then. If they can do that with me, I should be able to do that with my colleagues, and then kind of set that across. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. And it's interesting you say that. One of the other conversations in this series, we talked about when, for example, when funding is cut and services have to be pulled back and there's some very difficult decisions to be made, and those working in your organisation get very angry about that and upset about that, rightfully so, and that it's okay and indeed good as a leader to be able to say, I'm angry about that too. And how do leaders find the line where I feel this, and it's good that you can say I feel this or I think this, to actually I need to draw a line, because as you say there, you use the term greatly, I need to hold some of this for you so that you can feel like that and we can move on. How do you find that balance or that point?
I think really it is just holding in your head how far you're going. So while there's a lot of, I think, quite interesting work in leadership theory now about what you share, how much of yourself you share, how much of yourself as a person you share, I think it is just I think it's probably a tension, actually, rather than a problem to solve. It's a tension to hold. I tend to try and be as factual as possible, but I will often actually say, it's okay, I don't need you to do anything about this. Or like, I am also ragingly angry about this cut, because let's be honest, of course everybody is, but I don't need you, oh colleague, to do anything about this. I'm just letting you know. Whether any of this is how that feels for my colleagues, I'll find out after the podcast. I'll be able to come back and tell me.
Well, an email address at the moment at the bottom that they can respond to. That sounds like we've had some great fun working out which writers and leadership speakers we've been linking into subconsciously in some of these conversations. So if we think of the Brené Brown work that she does about vulnerability, but also boundaries and understanding where you feel it's safe to share or not. And I was really interested when you said earlier you feel you're further down the introverted side of the spectrum. And up until maybe 10 years ago, there was this idea that good leaders were extroverts or had an extroverted preference, if I put my professional hat on. Yet with Susan Cain's work, amongst others, this idea of, you can be a great leader, whatever that preference is. I wonder if those with a preference for introversion maybe find that line more easily, or whether it is just a case of you need to understand self, whatever your preference, and you need to work out what that boundary is. Brené Brown does the spinny ring thing. Have you seen her do the spinny ring?
No, what's that?
So if you're asked to do something or you're asked to share something and you're not sure, or inside you think, I don't want to do that, or I don't want to do it, I don't want to share that, but you don't just want to turn around and blurt out no because you feel that if they've asked, I must. She's got this thing, she spins her ring 3 times, which gives her enough time to go, where's my boundary? And then she can go, actually, I think the example she uses is baking cookies for a school sale or something, but that spinning it 3 times, it's almost like a bit of a well-being habit, a calming habit, anchoring maybe. And she goes, actually, thank you for asking, but no, I'm not going to do that. Or I'm unable to, or I don't want to. And, that takes quite a lot of vulnerability to say no and to make yourself look unpopular possibly. But also you need to really understand where your comfort level is. Mm-hmm. So I could get really, really angry about this because it's not fair. But actually, if I do that, the example of my setting, where do I have to kind of set that limit? So how do you set boundaries for yourself as a leader?
I like that thing about, that taking a pause before you do. I know it's probably misattributed, but between stimulus and response, there's a space kind of thing. And I took great comfort from that. I did some work in ACT. Because I used to be a social worker, I've still got a kind of interest in different approaches to therapy and things like that. I think that's the biggest challenge, to be honest, particularly in the third sector, because and probably in the public sector generally, because we're mission driven. Mission can eat you alive. And I think it's too easy to keep saying yes. And I think we're going to go on later to say about kind of challenges in leadership. I think that's my biggest challenge, and in common with a lot of other CEOs of SME third sector, because we really want to change the world, and we have 50p and a bit of string and 4 people and half a photocopier. Now there is a massive disparity in our ambition and our resource, and I think it can lead us there very quickly. So what I do don't use the spinny ring thing. I like that because it's very subtle. Like I might steal that, but I do tend to try and just take a minute before I say yes, because I have a tendency to just go, yeah, why not?
We could
do that.
Yeah.
Actually, no, we can't. Because you need to be careful not to go off the other end of the scale as well. I mean, I do work with other organisations, particularly because we're in a time of cuts and people's resources are absolutely zeroed. But there's a risk of losing your mission and losing your purpose in the defence of your organisation, which is the other, I think, big challenge for all of us, that you can't just say, no, I haven't got the resource, no, I'm not doing anything. But equally, if you just say yes all the time, it doesn't mean anything. And then you don't deliver, and then there's bigger problems. And yeah. If I had an easy fix, it'd be great.
How important is the identity of the organisation to you and those who work with it? Because you see there's so many organisations in social work, social care, third sector, voluntary space, was it over 300 in Scotland alone? How important is that identity of Iris?
It's massively important to me. I hope it's important to my colleagues. This is making me really reflect about what I should be asking them about next time I go back into the office. Because I think, particularly if you're in a crowded space like the third sector, there's loads of us, you need to have a really clear sense of what you do, why you do it, and how you do it. And we found in IRIS, because our job is really to help social work and social care do better for people, which is largely helping people clear away the barriers to good work. We tend not to have to work with people work with workers because they aren't doing something or whatever. It's usually something around them, their bureaucracy, the way the work is organised, the way relationships are, contracting, commissioning, all those kind of exciting things. Within that, we need to be really clear that that's our unique space. That is the thing that we bring, and we bring that support in a particular way. Like, we work to be skilled, professional, but warm and engaging and not scary at the same time, which again is an interesting combination of things to try and deliver. But the how of working with Iris, I think, is what makes our identity. And again, I'm back to that point about it's the experience of working with the organisation and the what we do, rather than maybe our list of laminated values. We don't have them values on a website or things like that.
So thinking about that identity, coming maybe to more personally for yourself as a leader, what is the toughest leadership challenge you've faced?
I have always struggled with making good ethical decisions when our funding has been cut or we've lost a contract, or and I think that's probably common across my sector. So what I mean by that is there's a high personal cost to being put at risk of redundancy and losing your role. And that's the highest personal cost in an organisation. I'm not playing a tiny violin just for me. But making an ethical set of decisions when all the decisions are pretty bad, I think is probably the biggest challenge I've had. So, we've lost colleagues because we didn't have enough funding. That's always a very difficult thing to do. And you always do wonder whether you're making the right choice. And you realise that whatever choice you make is not a great one. But I think that's facing the wider sector now, because I think we're coming to kind of a bit of a crunch point with, I'm hearing this from everyone. It's that whole, how do you make a good decision when all the decisions are pretty bad? So what you're doing is minimising how bad it is rather than making a good approach decision to do something better. So I find those very this is your Kobayashi Maru kind of Star Trek horror moment where you're like, actually there isn't a good outcome here, but we have to do the best we can within it. Otherwise, why are we doing any of this?
That kind of Hobson's choice.
Yeah.
So what is it in you as a leader that you draw on when you're faced with that's a grim situation?
I think I'm coming back to, I literally signed up for this. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but I think that is something that can be lost in the conversation about vulnerability. It's like you have literally chosen to be accountable and take those decisions. And the best thing you can do to draw on that is to listen to as many people as possible that are skilled and have something useful to say. And in the end, take the decision and live with the decision. It sounds simpler than it is to execute, but I don't think there's a magic kind of resource there to make those things better or easier. And it is just part of your role, and you need to do it.
The buck stops with you.
Well, yeah. I'm trying really hard not to say that, but I think that is actually what I'm saying. Yeah.
I guess literally, if we're talking about funding and funding decisions.
Well, yes.
So there's a number of senior leaders I've spoken to over the years who have said that it can be quite lonely when you are somebody in another one of these conversations talked about being the top of the pyramid. However small your pyramid is, you're still the top of the pyramid. And that actually it can feel really isolated. It can feel quite lonely. And that's, again, not about any more tiny violins. We're back to, in most other roles, you will have a peer or a team around you. And you mentioned your board before, but who else do you connect with or stay connected to minimise that isolation and find peers who you can have the conversations about that with?
So I've had some formal support, not at the moment, but I had a great coach for a while when I started as a CEO. I found that really, really helpful, particularly to work out some stuff that I felt was quite, I couldn't really share it more widely, because it was quite sensitive. So that was kind of the formal end. I am the daughter of a retired university principal, so there's lots of leaders in my family. So I do pick my dad's brains as well. From my role in CCPS, I met a lot of really talented third sector leaders, and we have good informal links. That's one of the resources, I think, of our sector. I know there's people I could pick up the phone to if I needed to chat to them, which I think is a great benefit. And these are people who've been in their positional leadership roles for like 10, 20 years. So there's loads of kind of expertise to draw from. And as I said, I've got a pretty expert board, a couple of third sector CEOs on the board, so they really understand the work, which, is quite lucky, actually.
Yeah, it's good. Talk a lot about the importance of reflective practice, whether that's personal. Some people love a journal, some people hate a journal. Some people love a regular coffee with someone where it can just be, how are things? So it's encouraging to hear that at that senior level, these things are still important and these things still make a difference. If there were people asking, how does it feel to be a chief exec of a small organisation, what do you think is your biggest challenge? First of all, as a leader yourself, and then we'll move on to the wider situation. So for you personally at that stage?
Trying to lead in uncertainty. I think that was a new thing. That was a new skill, actually. And trying to balance the realism of what's happening with the fact that you do still need to hold out some kind of purpose and hope within it. Because again, otherwise, why are we doing all of this? And actually, it's a slightly different point, but I was reflecting this as I walked down the road, understanding what good enough work is. Because I don't know, it's probably a temperamental thing, it might be a sector thing, but we want to do amazing, perfect work. And that totally gets in your way. And that's one of the things I've learned over 2 years since I became a CEO, is that actually you need to know what good enough is. And that's absolutely great. It's probably better than you think. Obviously, don't do bad work, but, let it go. Set it free, write the blog, put it on the website, do the thing. So that, I think that's a personal challenge for me. And probably, I wouldn't be fair to say it probably runs through our culture and something we need to keep an eye on in Iris.
I think that's really interesting, and I would agree. I see that in lots of ages and stages for leaders, this idea that you have to provide the best. So it's the curse of perfectionism almost. And even myself, knowing that somebody has said, it just needs to be good enough. And you kind of go, no, what's
It has to be
perfect? It has to be great. How do we work out what good enough looks like? What are there questions we should ask ourselves? How do we even start thinking about and getting okay with good enough?
Yeah, because you don't want the opposite either.
You don't want to get
I'm
so
back
used
at
to
you.
it, yeah.
It's like, oh, that'll do. No, I do use my colleagues a lot for this. I have some very talented colleagues with skills in areas I don't have skills in. Like I have research colleagues and people with specialisms I don't have the background in. I think that's a useful corrective to checking in and saying, actually, does this work? Does it make sense? Would that be enough for you to go take the action, do the thing, join the workshop, whatever it is? Do make use of that. I think it's probably more difficult on a systemic level because we're all driven by the kind of hangover of new public management. We're all like, we're the best, we're amazing, look at us, resource us, we're great, to the exclusion of all others, whether it's either sector, organisation, profession, whatever it is, particularly when cuts come. So it's actually harder to tell the truth and to say things like, yeah, that's good enough, we can get on and do it. Yeah, I think it's a challenge because the drivers on your role run counter to what you know you need to do a lot of the time. And until we reset those drivers, I think we'll always have this kind of struggle in leadership between the hero CEO with the KPIs and the sort of, systemic, collaborative, let's get the thing done. We know the resources aren't here. Let's make the best use of what we've got. I feel like we're kind of still standing between those two extremes, and hopefully we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet.
So that leads us quite nicely into thinking about what, in your opinion, is the wider leadership challenge in your sector at this time?
I think it's how we're responding to the cuts in the funding environment. Because I think the temptation is when resources are cut and they're cut in a sort of general way. So they're cut on a sort of salami slice basis. We'll take 5% here, 10% across the board. It makes leaders retrench. We kind of pull back and we say, I need to defend my organisation, my outcomes, my people, my staff. It's all about my profession, my sector, whatever it is. And there's a place for that. But paradoxically, when you reduce funding resource, the worst thing you can do is increase controls. The best thing to do is to actually release your grip on the minutiae of cuts and say, what can we do with the resource in its totality? And then make in principle decisions about what we fund rather than like cutting little bits off things. But again, it's a particularly difficult shift because the drivers on leaders, and this is probably not just the third sector, are to look after your organisation, promote your organisation, look after your staff. These are all really good things. But there's a risk that when we're under pressure, we do that to the exclusion of what we all got into this business for, which was to make things better for people. And I think that requires a courage and a truth-telling that we're maybe not quite ready for. I'm going to have to do this now. I have to go around and tell everybody the truth about everything.
So at times when we have these financial cuts, and at the moment they are cross-sector, aren't they, what we're experiencing at the moment, this idea that you can do less with more, let's get creative, this is where innovation springs from, and that mindset of holding on to controls and protecting your own organisation, which many leaders do in some ways rightly, but those controls can feel a bit tight. How do we help people think more openly about what can be done? How do we get leaders to talk to other leaders in other organisations and to pull that collaborative piece you were speaking about before together?
Yeah, and I would agree. I think frugal innovation works only in a very limited way. It's worked in some product development, some very famous stuff that people have spoken about, but I don't think it transfers over to social care, social work and support. It's a different kind of thing, and I do think it's a convenient fiction. And again, I'm kind of coming back to the truth-telling aspect there. Like, it's a cut. It's a cut. You need to own it. It's your decision. You need to own it. But I think what we can do, and I think the only thing we can do, is for individual leaders to be the person who says, why don't we just try and do this anyway? That feels like quite a risky thing to do. I've tried it recently and I was very fortunate. I got a good response from the other organisations. But it's that kind of variation, and it's a bit of a hackneyed thing to say, but, the best time to have fixed our collaborative problems, our issues with leadership and how we make decisions and all of that was 20 years ago when apparently there was lots of money, so people tell me. But the next best time is now, your classic coaching kind of statement. So that is kind of the only thing that's left to us. But I think one of the useful things I found in this little piece of work that we're just kicking off with a couple of large public bodies was to say, I know you haven't got any money to spare. I know you haven't got much resource, neither do we. But what can we at the margins put together to do this fairly boundaried initiative to get us started? And my hope is that that will give us the kind of testing ground to do a bit of that collaborative work within a very restricted, this is almost a zero budget project, that then hopefully will build our capacity for doing it later when, here's hoping, the picture isn't so bleak and we aren't all so kind of like constrained in what we're able to do.
There is a phrase similar to that, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And if you think about the length of time it takes for a tree to grow into something sturdy and established, I really like that idea of let's do the seed bit.
Yeah.
Let's do the first bit now. At least have the conversations, get the right people involved in the conversations. So if you wait for funding, it'll never come. Is that not the case, essentially?
Yeah, which is, is that a very hopeless message? I don't know. No, I think what I'm trying to get at is leading an uncertainty is about doing a thing even though you don't know if the resource is coming. I'm the last person to say you can do it on nothing. There's a minimum operating cost for every organisation, and I think most organisations are hitting that now, and I think that's partly why there's so much distress around and so much difficulty, because we're hitting the kind of critical minimum margins no matter what size we are, and that is that's a recipe for making this kind of thing difficult. But I think your point about trees and growth and time is a good one, because we do want change to happen really quickly. And we're an innovation and improvement organisation. Our job is to go in and help people make things better. And we do it on a 12-month basis. If you think about, if you've ever tried to change something personally, it took me a lot longer than 12 months, to, I don't know, eat more vegetables, get fit, learn the piano, whatever it is your thing is. We know from personal experience how hard it is to change your behaviour. But somehow when we get together in groups as leaders, we think it should happen in 6 months with an MOU and a couple of meetings. So there is, again, a bit of a realism piece there, and to say, draw on our own experience and say, okay, how long did it take me to, I don't know, give up coffee? That's never going to happen, but whatever it is. And therefore, if we're trying to do this thing at scale with a big group of people whose boss we're often not, because we're often not the positional leader in the room, so it's not like even if we wanted to, we could just make people. What's a reasonable amount of time? What's a reasonable amount of change? And I don't think we've quite got to the bottom of that yet either.
And that'll vary, won't it, in terms of what we're trying to do and what the art of the possible is. And that kind of phrase of, can we just have the first conversation? Can we plant the seed, whether it's a metaphorical one or a real one? Because if we put off the conversation, we don't start anything, do we? At least if we start, we've got an idea, and who knows what could come out of that conversation. But, and it did. You're right. For a moment there, it felt quite hopeless. That's the way I phrased that question. That's my bad. But there is lots of hope for our sector, isn't there? Around just now, we've got lots of good people who want to do good things. What is the best thing about working in third sector and voluntary?
One of the good things about being a leader of a really small organisation is you're very close to delivery. So I do direct support with local areas, and sometimes I complain about that because I feel like I don't have time, but actually it's one of the best bits of my job because I'm still connected with the work. And I am constantly surprised and delighted by the number of extremely under pressure people that come to us and say, this is really difficult. We have massive waiting lists. We need to do this. We have this huge shopping list of change and we've got no resources, but we still want you to come, Iris, and give us a hand because we can see the better is possible. And I just think it's an absolutely remarkable thing about the public sector in general. I mean, some of these partners are local authority, some are voluntary sector, is the ability to see what could be, even though you're in the middle of a massive storm. So we just completed a piece of work that we're writing up just now, and we had that great bit where you have a bit of a celebration and you kind of get people together and you see how far people have come. And the fact that they are continuing with their making wise, sensible, targeted change while dealing with massive local cuts, lots of relational issues, increasing demand, all the things that happen in social work and social care. That I just thought was incredibly hopeful. These are really tough people, tough in the right way, and kind of committed to getting things done, it's exciting. I like that.
Are we back to shared non-laminated values and a shared kind of similar purpose personally as well as in organisations? But I think that also takes a humility, doesn't it, to go, let's see what we can do. There is no necessarily right answer. Let's get together and see.
I think it's really bold actually to do that, because again, it's not really. I'm back giving the straw man hero leader a kicking. But that's not really what you're supposed to say. Oh, well, let's give it a go, let's try it. But the fact that still exists, I think, is extraordinary, and we need to make sure that doesn't get crushed in amongst all of these, cuts and difficulties. But we've just gone out to the sector to ask for partners for next year, and we're still getting them. People are still wanting to make really bold changes, which is fantastic.
It's been great talking to you today, Dee, and I'm going to finish our conversation with one last question, which is, what would you really like to see change within the next 4 or 5 years?
Overall, I would like us as leaders and a system in general to stop admiring the problem, which we're very, very good at. So we write lots of, and I am guilty of this too, we write lots of papers about how terrible everything is, and we count it and we put it into graphs and we talk to each other about it at meetings. I would like us just to step decisively out of admiring the problem. We know what it looks like, and get to taking action together.
That's a fantastic point to finish on. And so with that, I will say thank you so much for your time, Dee Fraser.
Thank you.